Today, we're cracking open a real financial detective story. It's a classic case of the rulebook versus the referee, and the results are pretty surprising. So let's start with a big question. I mean, what would actually happen if you could get the entire world to agree on one single set of financial rules? You'd think it would make everything clearer, safer, maybe even more profitable for everyone, right? Well, that's the giant experiment at the heart of our story today. All right, so our story really kicks off with the creation of this global rulebook. It was a massive moment in financial history, one that promised to change pretty much everything. The year is 2005, and something absolutely huge is happening in the world of accounting. The researchers who studied this called it the largest reporting standards change in accounting history. And they weren't kidding. Just about overnight, over 100 countries, including the entire EU, all flipped the switch to a single set of rules. Just a monumental shift. And this new system? It's called the International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS for short. The easiest way to think about it is just as a global rulebook. The idea was simple, but really powerful. Let's create one language for business, So an investor in Tokyo can look at a company in Berlin and understand its health just as easily as a company right next door. So the promise here was enormous. But when a few researchers started digging into the data, especially what was happening in the European Union, they didn't find the simple success story everyone expected. Nope. Instead, they found a really strange puzzle. I mean, on paper, this should have been a slam dunk. More stable markets, easier for money to flow across borders. I mean, everyone playing by the same rules has to be a good thing, right? But when researchers Hans Christensen, Lucy Hale, and Christian Lloyds got their hands on the numbers, the results were not at all what anyone predicted. Okay, so take a look at this. This is where things get really interesting. This chart shows market liquidity, which is just a fancy way of saying how easy and cheap it is to trade a stock. And you see that first bar? It's a massive improvement, a huge jump. But it only happened in a very specific small group of EU countries. For everyone else, the rest of the EU and countries outside the EU, the needle barely even moved. And that was the mystery. The rulebook was exactly the same for everybody. So why did the actual benefits, the real measurable economic improvements, only pop up in a few select places? This is the puzzle our financial detectives had to solve. So how do you solve a mystery like this? Well, like any good investigation, the first thing you do is you line up the usual suspects. You figure out all the possible explanations for this weird pattern you're seeing in the data. The researchers came up with 4 main possibilities. Suspect number 1, maybe the rulebook was the key, but the effect was just really subtle everywhere else. Suspect 2, maybe the rulebook only works if you're in a country that already has a strong legal system to back it up. 3, maybe it's not just the rulebook, but the rulebook plus a brand new referee enforcing it. Or, suspect 4, maybe it's all just a big coincidence caused by some other economic stuff happening at the same time. Okay, we've got our suspects. Now for the fun part, the detective work. The researchers designed some really clever tests to figure out which of these theories actually held water and which ones they could toss out. So let's start with suspect number 2, the idea that you needed strong laws already in place. The researchers looked at places like Australia, which has a top-notch legal system, but they didn't see the same benefits. And even inside the EU, countries with great laws saw no real improvement unless something else was going on. So strong laws by themselves? Not the answer. Suspect number 2 is officially eliminated. Now check this out. This was a brilliant move to test suspect number 1, the rulebook itself. The researchers found a bunch of companies that were already using the new IFRS rules, totally voluntarily, before the 2005 mandate even happened. So for them, the rulebook didn't change at all, right? And here's what happened. In the countries that also changed their enforcement, these firms still got a big liquidity boost. But in countries without those enforcement changes, nothing. So if the rules weren't changing for these companies, something else had to be causing the improvement. And this right here, this is the smoking gun. Take a look at Sweden. They adopted the new rulebook in 2005. And crickets. No real benefit. Then, 2 years later, in 2007, they changed how they enforce the rules. And that's when their liquidity shot up. Now look at Japan. They never adopted the IFRS rulebook, but in 2005, they seriously beefed up their own enforcement system and, boom, they saw a very similar positive effect in their markets. The evidence was just becoming impossible to ignore. So after all that, after ruling out the other suspects, we finally arrive at the big reveal. The identity of the real culprit becomes crystal clear. After all that incredible analysis, the conclusion was inescapable. The massive benefits everyone saw, they were not caused by that new, shiny global rulebook. It was the new referee. The real change, the thing that actually moved the needle, was a fundamental shift in how the rules were being enforced. So what exactly does a new referee even mean here? Well, in those 5 specific EU countries, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and the UK, they didn't just adopt the new rules. At the same time, they made what the paper calls substantive changes to enforcement. This means they created brand new supervisory agencies and, for the first time, started proactively digging into company reports to make sure the rules were actually being followed. And look, you don't have to take my word for it. The researchers themselves put it pretty bluntly in their conclusion. They wrote, "The change to IFRS is unlikely to be the main or even an important driver of the observed capital market effects." Case closed. Okay, so this is a super fascinating academic puzzle for sure. But why should this financial detective story actually matter to the rest of us? Because the effects are real, and we're talking about millions of dollars. The study estimated that for the average company in those 5 countries, the ones with the new referee, annual trading costs dropped by about $1.5 million. That is real money that makes markets work better. It lowers the cost of business and frees up capital that can be used for growth, innovation, creating jobs. It affects everybody. So the big takeaway, the lesson here, is that standards by themselves are not enough. A rule book is absolutely essential. It sets the rules of the game. But it's the referee, the strong, active enforcement that makes sure people actually follow the rules and that the game is fair. You've got to have both. One without the other is like a promise with no follow-through. And that really brings us to a final pretty big question, doesn't it? Because this idea doesn't just apply to financial markets. It's a universal lesson. It makes you wonder, in how many other parts of our lives, our work, our societies, are we pouring all our energy into writing the perfect set of rules while completely forgetting to empower and fund the referee? That's the real billion-dollar question, isn't it?